Today we're going to look at another section of Mark's biography of Jesus, and we're going to look at how the law is reimagined by Jesus as not being the letter for Christians, but the spirit. To go from the letter of the law to the spirit of the law. Let me get back to that. First, I just want to share with you what's going on in my life and Susan's life as we get ready to head out on our mission trip tonight. We leave in the evening. We're flying 9,000 miles to Bangladesh. It will be a 30-hour door-to-door. Maybe not as long as the Fish family is used to. I don't know. That's about what you guys do too. It's interesting. I didn't know very much about Bangladesh. Probably like most of you, all I remembered was the concert for Bangladesh with George Harrison. That's what the top Google search is when you type in Bangladesh in Google. But that was for a famine in Bangladesh, and that is indeed a problem for that poor country. It's about the size of Florida. Florida has 18 million people. Bangladesh has 160 million people. So you think it's busy during the season here. Try bringing 160 million people to Florida. As it developed as a nation, it was one time ruled by the Hindus, later on by the Buddhists, and in the 14th century, the Muslims decided to join the party. And so today it is a 99% Muslim nation. The Christian population is a whopping 0.5% of the population. But then again, 0.5% of 160 million, I probably won't get to meet them all while I'm there, but maybe nearly all of them. They were under British rule for over 200 years, along with the rest of India, and when Britain pulled out, they formed the state of Pakistan, East Pakistan and West Pakistan, separated by their Muslim background from the Indian main continent and by 1,000 miles from each other. You can imagine how well that worked out. 1,000 miles apart. It didn't last long. By 1971, Bangladesh fought its war of independence and now is an independent nation, but it is poor. It's developing. And the reason we're going is that it's in the top 10 of nations involved in human trafficking. Tens of thousands of men, women, and children trafficked there. Very vulnerable. Many nations around ready to pick off their poor citizens for their nefarious and greedy actions. And so we're going there to find out what Operation Mobilization and Freedom Challenge is up to there. Susan will be doing a 3-day conference with 70 new women Christians. I can't imagine, and I'll never get to know what it was like because men are not invited. Sort of like the garden. So Susan will be working with people, especially who have been involved in trauma and using her professional background for trauma treatment, and also her background is a church leader and doing presentations along with several other ladies there. It should be an unforgettable experience. I can't wait for her to share it with all of us. I'll be visiting Christian churches and touring and meeting pastors of various congregations there, and I'm really curious to find out what it's like to be in the 0.5% of a country, 99% Muslim. That will be part of my learning process. We'll also be going to visit the ROHINGYA refugee camp. It's a settlement of 800,000 Muslims who have been expelled from neighboring Myanmar, formerly named Burma. It's a Buddhist country, and they don't want Muslims anymore. Even though they've had Muslims for hundreds and hundreds of years, they've changed their mind, and they are kicking them out into the worst conditions you can imagine. It's a humanitarian crisis of a tremendous size. It brings up all the issues we've been having with refugees all over the world. And sadly, we hoped perhaps in the modern era religion would no longer be a source of conflict, but it quite clearly has even become a greater sense of conflict. We don't know the solution. All we can do is go there and pray and learn and come back and share. And so that's the goals of our trip, and I hope that you'll pray for us and think of us, and we can't wait to share what we have learned on that experience. Now, to get back to our text in Mark, it seems like a very trivial matter, right? Jesus' disciples have gone right to dinner without ceremonially washing their hands. Not sure exactly why they didn't. Too busy, no ceremonial water at hand. Maybe they were just fishermen and hadn't really followed those ceremonies much in their life anyway, but they got caught red-handed, so to speak, not doing what the law required. Now you say, what a silly law, right? I mean, it's good for sanitation, but for ceremony? Just to sprinkle some water on your hands before you eat and to be condemned if you don't? Let me ask you, and I don't see it right now, so I think I'm safe. What if somewhere here in the front of our church, a young man came in, he was wearing a baseball cap, and he chose to leave the baseball cap on his head during our service? Now, when I said that at the first service, someone actually shouted out, "Take it off!" And I thought I was at a burlesque show for a minute. "Take it off," she said. I'm like, wow, you just made my sermon. But maybe you might think, why aren't they taking their hat off? I mean, it's a sign of respect. Except if you went to church here yesterday, they would ask you to put a hat on without the brim, because it's a Messianic Christian church, and they ask you to cover your head as a sign of respect. It's actually more biblical for men to cover their heads than to leave their heads uncovered. But we've lost track of that because in our culture, taking your hat off is a sign of respect and civility. This is a trivial thing, right? Except that it would bother all of us, wouldn't it, if the hat was left on, because we would think they weren't honoring God during that time. We might wonder if we were younger at a Protestant church. They'd wonder at the sight of someone when the pastor says, "In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit," we saw them doing this thing. I mean, when I was a kid, if you saw somebody doing that, you thought they were having epilepsy. I didn't know what that was. On the other hand, if you went to a Catholic church and you didn't do this, they might wonder what's wrong with you too, right? What is this? It's just a ritual. It's not even really in the Bible, but it matters to people. It's a sign of respect for God or faithfulness. If somebody around here was to pick up their phone during the service, and that never happens, and start reading intently what's on their Tinder site, people around might get a little offended. The pastors won't, because we're used to people doing all sorts of things, including falling asleep. Now, wait a minute. What if the man has left his hat on because he just went through chemotherapy, and instead of being like these two guys and almost me, preparing for Lent, he was embarrassed that he had no hair? Then how would you feel? How would you feel if the person who came to our church and crossed themselves didn't know you weren't supposed to do it, or went to the other church and didn't do it, and didn't know they were supposed to because they just didn't know, because they'd never been there before? Would you judge them the same way? And what if the person answering the phone had just left home a sick child and said to that child, "You call me if you feel any worse"? You see, these laws, they're to show respect, to show reverence. Some of them are in the Bible, some of them are part of our tradition. They're in there. They're good for that, but when we don't consider the full implications, what if the disciples simply did not have the water to do it? You see, we've got to watch, along with the Pharisees, as to whether our traditions are getting in the way of our faith. Whether the letter of the law is getting in the way of the spirit of the law. If your wife is in labor and, God forbid, she's crowning in your living room and you are getting her into a car and you jump into the car and you drive 30 miles an hour through your neighborhood. That's the speed limit. What do you think she might say about that? So the law followed without any further reflection is potentially, it's respectful but potentially dangerous or harmful. And that's what Jesus is approaching us on. I want to be clear that the Bible is filled with passages encouraging us to do certain things, to enact certain rituals, to be part of God's holiness, to show holiness, to express our sense of how God is holy. It's biblical. It honors God. It helps form a certain type of character when certain traditions are followed. It even puts what they call a hedge around the real law, because if you are careful with the little things, you'll be careful with the big thing. It's a little odd, I think. I won't say odd. It's different. It's different that some people here on Saturdays up and down Spanish River are wearing black clothes and walking to church, right? They're walking to church. The deals can make a fortune when they sell their house because they're within enough steps of the Orthodox synagogue that you can take those steps according to the Bible. But you have to walk. You have to walk. It's beautiful. Maybe we should walk to church. Some of you say, I live in Deerfield. Okay. Don't. We want you to come here. But in that walk, what do you think? They reflect on God. They have that time, the peace. They have an opportunity. It's not all bad. This is often preached as a sermon at how hypocritical, how blind, how ridiculous the Pharisees are and / Jews, Jews are. But let's give them credit. Through all they've been through, they've remained a certain kind of faithfulness. Maybe it's not always been helpful. Maybe sometimes it's all that they've had. When it's aimed to respecting God's holiness, it's a beautiful thing. And that's what Tevye, the dairyman in Fiddler on the Roof, points out. How many of you have seen Fiddler on the Roof? And in that wonderful show, Tevye is saying, tradition is what holds us together. It's the traditions that we follow that bind us together and help us continue to lift our eyes to God. If we don't keep the tradition, we'll be like a fiddler on the roof playing his tune who falls down and breaks his neck. It's the tradition that keeps us balanced in a life for them, especially of persecution, of always being on the run. In Russia in the 19th century, it was hard to be a Jew. Tradition held you together. It is a beautiful thing. And he shows so many ways that it's a beautiful thing. But he starts to get into a challenge, doesn't he, with his daughters. You remember the story, his daughters. His first daughter, he arranges a marriage for her. Unthinkable. She wants to marry someone she loves. And as he contemplates tradition versus this innovation, what does he rely on to make his final decision? His heart. I love her. She loves him. How can I put her together with a man that may never happen for? Here's what they want, and his heart tells him what to do with the tradition, and that is in this case to bend it. And then the next daughter comes along, and she wants to marry a political radical, barely Jewish at all, except in name. And he is furious because they don't ask his permission first. All they ask for is a blessing. He says, unthinkable. I can't offer my blessing without having received permission. Tradition. This is going to knock us right off the roof. And then he stops and he thinks. And he looks at her, and he looks at him. He looks at his wife and him, and he thinks with his heart. and gives permission and blessing. What a beautiful story so far, right? But then he hits the third daughter. This is true for all third daughters out there. She pushes it all away. She falls in love with a Gentile, a Christian. And Tevye says to himself, how far can a man bend before he breaks? How far can we tip the fiddler before he falls off the roof? How far can we take tradition and then lose it all? It's a great question. It's an honorable question. It's a fair question. And for him, he could not bend anymore. It's a painful part of the show. It's painful to see him say that his daughter is dead. Oh, he loves her. But his tradition keeps him together. Think about the Pharisees trying to hold on to their religion as Rome is trying to destroy them, right? They're just holding on, but they're misguided. They're misguided here because although Tevye got it right the first 2 times, Tevye did not get it right the third time. The first time, he looked at the law and he understood it with his heart. The second time, he looked at the law. He knew the letter of it, but he looked at the spirit of it. And he led with his heart. This third time, his heart just could not go any farther. And Jesus says, that's what you got to work on, buddies. Friends, you got to work on that. The law is only understood through love. It's only rightly interpreted through love. It's only properly applied through love. If there is no love, then the law is dead. It's a tool of destruction, of judgment, but love. He pointed out to the Pharisees, they had gone too far. They were using the law to get their own things accomplished that they wanted. It was a practice that you could say, my parents might be in need, but the money I have is dedicated to God, and so I can't give it to my parents. I'd have to give it to God only. Imagine if a law would allow you not to keep the main commandment, love your mother and father. But that's what was happening. The law was twisting and turning and shutting them off from the love that was intended. The traditions of the elders were no longer reflecting the heart of God. Here's the thing to Tevye's question. How far can a man go before he breaks? The answer for us is we don't have to break. We don't have to break. He broke himself for us. Jesus satisfied the law. Jesus on the cross said, listen, I know there's all sorts of codes and rituals and all sorts of things preventing you in so many ways from knowing God's love and living in that love. And so I'm going to show you in a way you will never forget, and we never have. The spirit of the law is love. It's not the law versus love. It's the law with love. It's love with law. I know some of you saying, I know where he's leading. We're going back to Woodstock. Everything's all right. Everything's fine. As long as you do it with a sincere attitude. No, not everything's right. Some things hurt people. That's not right. Some things hurt yourself. That's not right. But as we march down history, we have to keep figuring that out. We have to keep thinking that through. Can you imagine if we had said, oh my goodness, no divorced people are welcome in the pews today? And yet, only a generation ago, that pretty much would have been true. No one would have had to told you not to come back to church. You would have just known you wouldn't be welcome anymore. But love helped us with law. Love helped us understand that, you know what? Brokenness in marriage isn't something to turn our backs on. It's something to embrace to help bring healing. And maybe if we bring healing, maybe there will be less divorce. Loving becomes the priority in Jesus' thinking, in Jesus' teaching, in Jesus' living. And he wants the same for us. It helped me out a great deal. Susan will tell you that when I go to see something like a concert or a show, I'm really into it, and I don't like distractions. And it wasn't a couple years ago that there was somebody in front of me, and they were making whispers and noises and something, and I can't remember. Did I actually tell? No, I told Susan, I'm going crazy. Well, it turned out that the person in front of me was developmentally disabled. They couldn't help themselves. So wouldn't that have been great if Pastor Andy had shook him on the shoulder and say, shut up? That would have been super. Thank goodness she was with me to stop me from doing that. But at Fiddler on the Roof, this very week, behind me, just next to me, was another man with worse afflictions. He would laugh when you weren't supposed to. He was snorting, groaning, and coughing and wheezing. He was like this far away from me. And it didn't bother me at all. It didn't bother me at all. Because I said, I am so glad that he is getting to see this. And I'm so glad that the young lady that had brought him there was laughing with a laughter that I'm sure she doesn't get to laugh with very often, caring for someone like that. And I thought, oh Lord, you've done something to me. You've actually made me a tiny bit better. Oh, thank you. I got a long way to go. It's a challenge, friends. Jesus says, listen, what goes in you, not such a big deal. What comes out of you? That's what matters. And if the stuff that comes out of us doesn't show love, it's no good. It doesn't matter what we eat, how we wash our hands, how many times we go to church. Of course, you all know that. And so, it's a challenge. There's no way to know for sure how to do this every time. I really say, there's no way to be sure in each circumstance how to take law and understand it with love. We have to do that together. Divorce was unheard of, and now we found a way to love each other through it. Things come, things go. There's changes all the time. Unlike Tevye, we don't have to say, how far can we go before we break, because it's not up to us. Jesus keeps the law. Jesus will guide us. Jesus will help us figure out the best we can, how to deal with the new and constantly changing situations. Because after all, Tevye had 5 daughters in the play. There were 2 more. Can you imagine what they were going to be up to? What challenges they would propose to him that were still ahead? One shudders to think. But it was too late for him because his heart was done. He couldn't use his heart to understand the law anymore. And let it not be that way for us. Let our hearts stay warm, stay open, be willing to struggle, to say, what does the law say? What does love say? What does love say? What a lifestyle Jesus offers to us. It's much better than the life of a fiddler on the roof. My aunt was a really sweet lady. My uncle was young, so she was pretty young too when I knew them well, and she was a little bit of a renegade in the Dutch Reformed Church. Anybody Dutch Reformed here? It's pretty conservative, right? Pretty traditional, lots of rules. You're not allowed to have TV, not allowed to drink. So everybody who's Dutch Reformed apparently has these really cool bookshelves that turn so that the TV can be turned into position, and then that's what I was told. I think there's a liquor cabinet the same way. Soda on one side, or I don't know, maybe put the Coca-Cola. Be careful when you go there, what's in it. She had her own way. She was supposed to wear a hat, and Dutch Reformed women are supposed to wear hats. I think they were supposed to wear them all the time, but especially at church. And she would get out of her car at church, and she would go into her trunk, and she would open up, and out of the hat box, she would take her hat. She'd put her hat on. She'd go into church. She'd come out. She'd take it out, put it back in the hat box for the rest of the week, close the trunk. And I remember my uncle saying that was very hypocritical. Of course, he didn't go to church, so it was easy for him. Very hypocritical. You're supposed to wear a hat all the time, but you're only wearing it at church. And I don't know if it was hypocritical or not, but I do know that when her son was in a terrible accident, that she cared for him 24/7 with more love than anybody could show, which makes me wonder, friends. Maybe sometimes we do put the hat on, cross ourselves, take the hat off. That some traditions, they matter, they don't. But one thing from Jesus is clear: love matters. And the spirit of the law is love. Amen.